The Bristol Motor Speedway, the last great Coliseum. A track synonymous with beatin' and bangin' good old-fashioned NASCAR racing, what is seen as the best of the best. So why does Bristol, the track we all know and love, have to be covered by Tennessee clay this year, essentially eliminating a date, the spring date that is, from the original layout? It's an honest-to-God good question to have. And it's a bit of a case study in seeing how NASCAR through the years has dropped off. But this one in particular is kind of staggering. This isn't something where NASCAR jumped onto this race as a fad. This isn't something where it was sort of viewed as a good thing at the time and now it's out of date. No, Bristol has been in NASCAR for decades and, well, it's pretty jarring to see just how far the spring race has fallen. So today we're going to look into why the Bristol spring race has fallen so bad. Starting off, we got to look at how it grew up. It grew the way that NASCAR did. Over the 90s and early 2000s, NASCAR was continuously getting more and more viewers, and there was more demand for NASCAR racing. Bristol, in this way, was the one track who kind of went completely overboard with it. While a lot of tracks built up a ton around their tracks, no track really built up the grandstands as much as Bristol did. See, Bristol wasn't always a Coliseum, but through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, they continuously just built up and up and up until they had over 160,000 seats inside the Great Coliseum. But that wasn't too bad at the time, as from about 2003 through the late 2000s, 160,000 people showed up to every race. According to the estimates from NASCAR and SMI, there were sellouts all the way through 2009. So it's not like Bristol was a track that was immediately hit when everything went to hell and back for NASCAR. For the viewership overall and the mystique of this race, the day race, while not having the same lore of the night race, was one of the most watched NASCAR races of the year every year, and it peaked in 2005 with the sport, with a 6.3 rating and 9.75 million people watching it from home. Of course, having 160,000 people watching at the track was big too. But having 6.3% of the country watching Bristol is a big point to look at. Now, in 2006, as the sport started to decline and into 2007, so did the viewership for this race. That shouldn't be a surprise whatsoever. Even though it went up a bit in 2008, the recession really hit the sport hard, and it was pretty easy to see why this race had lost about 2.5 million viewers and a good third of its audience between 2005 and 2009. But there's something that I think should really be noted here. From 2009 to 2014, even when the sport's popularity fell off a ton, the Bristol day race didn't. Between these 6 years, the average viewership for these races was always between 7.24 million and 7.5 million, which is not that big of a margin when you consider how much NASCAR fell at the time. From 2009 to 2014, NASCAR's audience fell well over 30%, but the Bristol race here between those years was basically even. There were no rainouts in this time between 2013 and 2009, and the first part of the 2014 race, even though it was rained out after 124 laps, still had 7.3 million watching on TV, which could lend the idea that it could have actually been higher than any of these races too, as more people view later in the day. So Bristol has always been a draw. The average rating was always between 4.3 and 4.6 as well. Again, much better than most NASCAR races around it at the time. But the attendance is where the first issues were. From 2009 all the way till 2012, NASCAR still did attendance estimates. And even with these overinflated estimates, they still lost about 60,000 viewers in a 4-year span between these races, which was pretty jarring. In 2012, even with over 100,000 people estimated to have been coming to this race, this was actually setting off alarm bells at both SMI and NASCAR. So, between the races of the day race and night race in 2012, the track was reconfigured. The top lane ground down in an attempt to make the bottom lane the only lane to go on and revive the old freight train Bristol that fans were longing for. Instead, it made Bristol really a freight train on the top. But after the new contract came into effect in 2015, that's where you started to see this race tumble on the TV side. See, from 2015 all the way till 2019, this race went from the 7.3 million watching at the start of 14 all the way down to 2.8 million. And that meant that the track had lost 71% of its viewership on TV since the peak, with a 1.7 rating and a 2.81 million viewership number in 2019. But there's a lot of stuff that's happened between this time, and this is what affected the attendance so bad, as from this time as well, 96,000 showed up estimated in 2014 compared to about 30,000 in 2019, meaning that since the peak, there was an 82% drop in at-track attendance. But when you look at the Gen 6 era, everything that could have went wrong with Bristol did go wrong. And I think this is what did the long-term effects and bad effects at that on this race. To start with, the first Gen 6 race was okay. It did have a bit of a scuffle afterwards between Joey Logano and Denny Hamlin, but it was nothing special whatsoever. The next year, like I said, the first 124 laps were on Fox, but because of rain, the rest had to finish on Fox Sports 1. Then, also in 2015, because they wanted to avoid rain, the race was moved later in the season, and that did not avoid rain whatsoever. Rain ended up postponing part of that race, and it had to finish later in the night. So, when you had 2016 roll around, the effects of this were definitely seen. There was no rain, but there was lucky to be even 50,000 people in the stands for that race. And it was a clear pinpoint on showing just how far this race had fallen. Then, when you would think that it would start to rebound, rain struck again, and it struck badly. 2017 and 2018 had rainouts that had to be shown on Monday mornings on Fox Sports 1. Of course, this was awful for the track. And in 2018, the viewership and attendance hit rock bottom for the pre-pandemic Bristol race. Just under 2 million people watched this race on TV, and maybe they were lucky to get 20,000 at the track. And in 2019, you could see the full effects of all of this. Yes, NASCAR had fallen off in attendance and in TV viewership around 2018 because of the Dale Jr. effect, the Jeff Gordon effect, all of that. But the race had 1.7 in the ratings department and 2.81 million viewers. This meant that this almost got a worse rating on a normal Sunday time slot than a Monday morning time slot in 2017. So you could see just how much the race had fallen off. Now, 2020 rolls around. The sport is starting to look like it's getting back on its feet a little bit better. Everything is sort of leveled off. But, of course, the COVID pandemic hits. And because of this, of course, no one's going to be at the track only a few months after this starts. And only 2.93 million people watch on TV. Overall, this has absolutely plummeted, no matter how you look at it. So while NASCAR's fall itself definitely did do a big part of it, you got to remember a few huge things when it comes to this. In 2007, the COT came around and the first reconfiguration. The reconfiguration screwing up the racing big time to the point that a lot of old school fans left. The COT pissing off old school fans in general, making a bit of a fall off in the sport from about 07 to 09. At the same time, the recession hits, meaning that it's going to be harder to have an at-track presence when it comes to being a normal racing fan. Then you have to look at 2012. They had the new reconfiguration, and while it was still good, it was not the old Bristol that was promised. So, of course, less people would show up then. The Gen 6 shows up around 2013, and then rain affects it in 2014, 15, 17, 18, and if you want to count the Bristol Dirt Race last year, 2021. The COVID pandemic, of course, hits it hard as well. When you look at maybe 30,000 showing up in 2019, that's lower than Martinsville, that's lower than Richmond, that's lower than Phoenix, that's lower than pretty much every other race on the schedule. Yeah, we can look at Indianapolis, but Indianapolis seats around 300,000. So 60,000 people showing up is only going to be a little under 20%, whereas a little under 20% of the people showing up to Bristol nowadays, that is a lot more jarring. Before the change of dirt, it was one of the least watched races in person, and also it was one of the least watched races on TV because of all the different problems. While attendance doesn't matter in the grand scheme of money right now because of the TV deals, where it does matter is optics. And between Indianapolis and Bristol, those were the two worst races when it came to optics. When there's still 100,000 people out of the now 140,000 seating capacity stands at the night race, it still looks really well. But when you're having to shut off half of the seats at this track, it gets very, very noticeable. And in 2019, it just looked downright ugly, and you knew that something had to be done or this race would be completely taken off the schedule. So that's why we have Bristol Dirt now. When you look at Bristol Dirt, last year it had 1.8 in the ratings department and 3.1 million viewers, meaning it was the most watched Bristol race in the spring since 2016, even with a rainout. And it had probably the best crowd since 2016 as well, and that was even with COVID protocols making it around 30 to 35% capacity, though from people I know that were around there, they think it was a little bit more and they were fudging numbers. Either way, this race, even being on the dirt and pissing off old school fans, even with COVID restrictions and even with rain delaying it a day, this race still managed to be the most successful Bristol spring race, well, since Tony Stewart was racing. So that's why the Bristol Day race has fallen off so much. Now I want to pass this on to you. Do you think if Bristol brought this race back, it could survive? Or do you think that maybe it needs to be replaced by a different one? Maybe Bristol Dirt needs to stay? What do you think about the Bristol Day race? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're at it, leave a like on this video, share this video, and subscribe to my channel for more great NASCAR content. Thank you all so much for your support, both those who are channel members and every other one of you that is a subscriber of this channel. Thank you so much for us hitting 50,000. I cannot thank you enough. So until next time, have a good one.